Yep. So I wasn't actually going to do anything with this account, but I've wanted to speak out for a while about what I think about Islam, and this is the best way to do it. So here we go. I wrote a little file a while ago that I wanted to print out and post around my campus. And hey, why don't I read it? It's called, well, it's not really called anything, but you could call it Do Your Own Research on Islam. And I titled it that. I didn't really title it. I put that at the top. But I put that at the top in huge font because really that's what people should do. I mean, I think Muslims, devout Muslims, they want people to know what Islam is all about. And I want them to know what Islam is all about too. And so I wrote this. And I'm going to read it for you. And then maybe I'll make some comments. Do your own research on Islam. Here is what I wrote. Disagree with it, agree with it, hate it, stop watching, whatever you want to do. The American public remains dangerously unaware of the core issues regarding Islam. Although Islamic Awareness Week at this campus will attempt to educate and inform the student body and surrounding community, inherent bias exists that will not allow for a clear understanding. To understand the most important issues surrounding Islam, one needs to independently research the Islamic sources themselves. On the part of Muslims and non-Muslims alike, a distinction must be made between Muslims and Islam. For instance, the promotional video on YouTube for Islamic Awareness Week at this campus does not make this distinction when it says only 1 out of 5 Americans meet a Muslim once a week. Media is the primary source of information. Meeting a Muslim in person, it is 4 times more likely you will have a positive opinion. Come and meet Muslims. While Muslims and Islam are obviously closely related, they are still different. Muslims are a group of people. Islam is a religion. Is Islamic Awareness Week about improving the image of Muslims or of Islam? That being said, an understanding and judgment of Islam should not be based on the image or behavior of Muslims. At least solely based. It should be based on what Islam itself teaches through the Quran, Islamic holy book, the Hadith collections, stories of things Muhammad said and did, and the tafsir literature, exegetical commentary on the Quran, most commonly by very early Muslims. And when I was writing this, I didn't know about the seerah literature, the biography of Muhammad, but that's also, now I know that the Quran, the Hadith, and the seerah make up the Sunnah. That's where the Sunnis get their names. Anyway. Only through research on relevant Islamic sources will one come to an understanding of Islam. A source of confusion in studying Islam comes from the fact that the Quran has 2 distinct periods of its history and a very unique doctrine that is meant to help differentiate between these 2 periods. Adding to the confusion is the fact that the Quran is not arranged chronologically, but rather by length of chapters. By this arrangement, the first chronological chapter appears in chapter 69. I think that's right. Earlier chapters were written when Muhammad was virtually powerless in Mecca. These verses tend to be very peaceful and benevolent in nature. Later Medinan chapters were written when Muhammad was a military and political leader in Medina. These chapters contain the most violent verses of the Quran. By the doctrine of abrogation laid out in chapter 2 verse 100 and chapter 16 verse 103, and by the way, Quran verses are not standardized, so if you look up chapter 2 verse 100, it might not be the verse I'm talking about. Same for 16, 103, they're a little off sometimes. By the doctrine of abrogation laid out in chapter 2 verse 100 and 16, 103, a later verse that seems to contradict an earlier verse is the verse that is meant to be followed. Let me repeat that. Only I'll reword it. By the doctrine of abrogation, a later verse that conflicts with an earlier verse is the verse you follow. Or an earlier verse that conflicts with a later verse is cancelled out. You follow the later verse when two verses conflict. Later violent verses contradict earlier peaceful verses, and by this doctrine are to be followed over the peaceful verses. This is key to understanding what Islam says about violence. And here is the last paragraph. I say all of that to tell you this. If you see what the Islamic sources say about important issues, you will come to see some painful truths. Islam is not a peaceful religion. Islam does not teach equality of men and women, or the equality of Muslims and non-Muslims. Islam does not value human rights and has no place in the 21st century. And I really do mean that. I really do mean that. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to comment on some of these things. First of all, I wrote this preempting Islamic Awareness Week, where I went to school, where I went to university. And Islamic Awareness Week in America is usually, well, it's pointless. It serves no good purpose, because what are you trying to raise awareness about? Between the West and the East, Middle East, which region do you think needs to have an Islamic Awareness Week the most? Because, I mean, we have it drummed into our heads by the media, not so much recently, thank God, that Islam is a religion of peace. Well, if Islam is a religion of peace and the Middle East has so much religious violence tied to Islam, then wouldn't it make more sense to have Islamic Awareness Week in these countries where so much religious violence is taking place? Because if the religion of Islam does not teach violence, does not exhort its followers to commit acts of violence in its name, then that means there are a lot of people in the Middle East that are misunderstanding their religion, right? And so, if we're going to have an Islamic Awareness Week anywhere, we need to have an Islamic Awareness Week in the Middle East. But the Muslim Student Association, or whatever they're called, probably are not going to be sponsoring that and carrying that out anytime soon, because, well, why would they? The real purpose of Islamic Awareness Week in the United States is to try to make Americans, or Europeans, or Westerners in general, think that Islam is a good religion, think that Islam is a good positive influence in the world today. Although this is slightly confused, because as I read in my little paper here, the Muslim Student Association at my university, they have Islamic Awareness Week, but then they talk about how you should come and meet Muslims, and then you'll have a positive opinion about Muslims. So the group of people, Muslims, and the religion Islam are being conflated. And this happens a lot in the media. If you talk about Islam, a lot of people take it as if you are criticizing Muslims, and you hate Muslims, and you just don't like them, and you want them to go, and maybe all sorts of other horrible things, I don't know. But that's not the case. If you criticize an idea, you are not necessarily hateful of the people who adhere to that idea. I have some really strong opinions about Islam, like you just heard, and I have some Muslim friends, and I've worked with Muslims. I've had Muslim classmates, and most of them have no idea that I have such strong opinions about Islam, because I don't throw it in their face, because I don't hate them, and I'm not going to try to make them feel bad. So that's one thing to consider. And this video, really, it's a spur of the moment thing. I was just on Paltalk, and Paltalk, if you go to any religious discussion having to do with Islam or Christianity on Paltalk, you're going to hear some people, well, I always hear some people saying some things that just make me angry. And so, I'm making a video about it. What do you know? So what else can I say about this? Well, like I was saying, I'll just continue what I was saying. People need to make a distinction between Muslims and Islam. And the media needs to make a distinction between Muslims and Islam. Because they're very different things. Like I said in my paper, Muslims are a group of people. Islam is a religion, a set of ideas. If you criticize one, you are not necessarily criticizing the other. I don't know how much more clearly I can say it. So, the whole idea that you are a racist and a bigot because you strongly disagree with Islam is ridiculous, and it's really just used to silence people who disagree with Islam. And honestly, I know this is kind of mixed up, because I'm just kind of, this is almost like a stream of consciousness kind of thing, but whatever. Anti-jihad writers, critics of Islam like Robert Spencer, Pamela Geller, Geert Wilders, they are not responsible for the violence in Norway. They're really not. Because like I said, if you criticize an idea, you're not necessarily criticizing the people. And in the case of Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer, if you criticize an idea, you're definitely not calling people to violence. And Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer, as far as I know, have never called their readers to violence against the Muslims or violence against anybody in the cause of resisting Islam. So, what I was going to say is that in reality, the people who are responsible for creating an atmosphere where something like the Norway massacres could take place are the media. They really are. And if you read the manifesto of Anders Breivik, you'll find this. Basically, the story is this. He wanted to get into politics. He wanted to have a public discussion about Islam. He wanted to get the truth out. He wanted to talk about the issues and what Islam says about them from Islamic sources. But he knew that if you talk about Islam, if you're critical of Islam, people are just going to brand you a racist or a Nazi or whatever. You will be shut down, nobody will listen to you, and that's it. So, discussion about Islam in the public sphere is so strongly discouraged that this guy, Anders Breivik, thought the only way he could have any kind of say in the matter publicly was to go and do something as ridiculous as he did. So the media are creating an atmosphere where you can't talk about Islam, you can't be critical of Islam, although this is eroding in on some networks, in some cases. But generally, probably much more so in Europe, if you're critical of Islam, that's it. You're done. You're not talking anymore. And so, what is... Some people are going to resort to this kind of violence. So it's not people like Robert Spencer or Pamela Geller who created an atmosphere where this could happen. It was people in the media, by creating an atmosphere where public debate is stifled. And actually, Anders Breivik, he quoted John F. Kennedy, I believe, in his manifesto, and I'll paraphrase it really quick. It was something like, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable." It's paraphrased. But that quote sums up his justification. He couldn't talk, so he saw no other way, and it's sad. I'll have much more to say.